Yeah, so I already had a little introduction there. I'm David Kennedy, and today we're going to be talking to you a little bit about IPv6 and why it's something we probably need to pay a little bit more attention to. Cool. So, according to Google, already almost 45% of their traffic is already happening over IPv6. And in Western Europe, nearly 60% of our devices support IPv6, right? So I think that IPv6 is actually the most forgotten about surface area in every organization's digital footprint, which is quite a bold statement. And quite often when I say that to organizations, they turn around and go, well, IPv6, I thought we only used IPv4. And hopefully over the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, we're going to answer that question, right? Now, to start, IPv6 is a little bit like digital Marmite, okay? There's people who absolutely love IPv6, want it deployed everywhere. There's those who hate IPv6, don't want it anywhere near their networks. And then actually with Marmite, there is a third and often forgotten about option, and that's those who go, what on earth is Marmite? And in this case, what on earth is IPv6? So what we're going to do is a little crash course into what IPv6 is, why we have it, and what problem does it actually solve? So hopefully you all know what an IP address is. It's basically a thing that gets us connected to the internet, allows devices to communicate with each other. So it's pretty important. Now, the version we're probably all aware of is IPv4. Looks a little bit like this. And now when IPv4 was created in around 1980, we had loads of these IPv4 addresses to give to all these devices that wanted to connect to the internet, because the internet wasn't very popular back then. But obviously now, as we know it, the internet's a pretty big and popular thing. And like all good things, we basically feasted on these IPv4 addresses. So ultimately, in 2019, we ran out altogether. So what we tried to do over the past couple of decades or so is prolong the life of IPv4 by using things like network address translation, carrier-grade network address translation, and these sort of centralized services. But even with those in place, it's still becoming harder and harder to connect devices to the internet. So what's the solution? No prizes for guessing. It's IPv6. Now, some of you might be thinking, hang on a minute, we've skipped one out there. We've gone from version 4 to version 6. What happened to version 5? Well, the talk's not long enough to sort of dig into that. Cool. So primarily what we get with IPv6 is an absolutely massive address space, and that's created by the inclusion of hexadecimal and also longer addresses, as we can see, compared to IPv4. Right? And ultimately what we basically end up with is this many addresses. So it's absolutely colossal number when we compare it to IPv4. Now, I find big numbers like that really hard to visualize. It just looks like a big number. So one way that you can visualize that is if you counted up every single grain of sand on Earth and made an Earth for every single grain of sand that you've got, and then across all those Earths that you've now just created, count up every single grain of sand. Once you've got that number, times it by about 5, and you're pretty much at that number there. So what that means is we've got plenty of addresses to go around to give every single device of today and those of the future to be able to connect those to the internet. And by connected, I mean that every single device gets its own public address assignment, which if you've not got networking rules in place and filtering, things like that, could be quite daunting. The other thing we get with IPv6 as well is that it can automatically configure itself on a network, and it's failure tolerant. So it's got some really good applications in sort of like IoT. I know some really good talks today as well about IoT, ICS, space as well. So there's some really good use cases there, right? So armed with that little bit of knowledge, let's go back to this question then of, well, IPv6, I thought we only used IPv4. So in short, IPv6 is already everywhere, right? And I mentioned earlier on in this talk that 60% of devices in Western Europe support IPv6. So, well, where's that figure come from? Well, IPv6 is enabled by default on Windows since Vista, since Server 2008, Mac OS, a good number of the Linux distributions as well, loads of the mobile operating systems, right? And Windows actually take that a little bit further as well. And if you've got a Windows device and you give it IPv6 and IPv4 connectivity, it will actually prioritize using IPv6 over IPv4. Cool. So hopefully we're starting to see that most of our organizations already have loads of devices in there that natively support IPv6. But what about if we go a little bit further upstream, right? And we go and have a look at our internet service providers, cloud service providers, and that sort of stuff. Well, BT, Sky, loads of altnets, the UK Educational Network, Janet, all support IPv6. So there's a possibility that you're actually using IPv6 right now. If we have a look at our cloud service providers as well, so the big ones, AWS, GCP, Azure, over the past couple of years, they've been making some really big pushes to offer IPv6 connectivity and IPv6 support. And actually what's happened this year is a couple of those cloud service providers have actually now started to charge for using public IPv4 addresses, whereas if you use IPv6, it's free, right? And there's actually one more driver that's happened over the past couple of years that's really sort of influencing the uptick of IPv6 adoption. And that's government mandates. So there's currently government mandates over in China, in the US, soon to be Germany, and even in places like Vietnam. They're actually dictating the deployment of IPv6. And in the case of China, by 2030, every single internet connected device in China is going to be IPv6 only, right? That's absolutely massive because already the amount of devices that are in China, but by 2030, every single one of those devices is going to be IPv6 only. So what does that mean for businesses, organizations, things like that? Well, if you want to continue being able to communicate with the entire internet, if you want to be able to communicate with, US federal departments, organizations over in China, then you're going to have to offer some sort of IPv6 support as well. Because natively, IPv6 and IPv4 aren't compatible with each other. All right? Okay, so what's the issue, right? We've got this technology that's going to be really important to the future, and it's already deployed in most places now. Well, IPv6 has basically snuck up on us. It was only a few years ago where people were basically saying IPv6 is next decade's problem. It's something in the future. We don't have to worry about it yet. Well, this is a pretty good figure. 10 years ago, IPv6 adoption, according to Google, was at 3%. Now it's almost 45%. And that rate is growing. So what's basically happened is we've got loads of organizations who are using IPv6 without actually knowing that they are. And just having a technology in sort of your stack that you don't really manage, you've not really got any control over, is already a big enough issue. Quite often as well, organizations don't really account for IPv6 when it comes to sort of audits, PCI compliance, ISO, all that sort of stuff. So that's maybe somewhere most organizations could start, right? Sometimes what I hear as well is organizations turn around and go, okay, well, we know we might be using IPv6 internally. It might be enabled on our devices, but we're certainly not using it externally outside of our networks, right? So some of you might be thinking, okay, well, if we've got a network where on all our devices IPv6 is basically enabled and they're looking for this IPv6 connectivity, well, what can an attacker do to exploit that sort of configuration, right? And there's documented cases of this happening. Basically what an attacker can do if they're local in a network is they can advertise themselves as a router that offers IPv6 connectivity. So what happens is you've got all these devices, which then, because they prefer IPv6 over IPv4, will use your router as the connection out to the internet. What basically happens is all that traffic bypasses all that sort of filtering and network rules that the organization's implemented for IPv4, right? Something else that people might have heard of and has actually been quite a good topic of discussion, especially in August, is something called extension headers. Now, IPv6 is designed to be around for at least the next 100 years, which means it's got to be compatible with use cases that we've not even thought about yet. And the way that it does that is with something called extension headers. Now, extension headers are notoriously easy to get wrong. As we saw in August Patch Tuesday, even certain operating systems don't get it quite right. And basically, if you handle extension headers wrong, what you can ultimately end up with is remotely exploitable conditions, remote code execution, data exfiltration, denial of service. So, it's all the good stuff. So how do we actually start going and reducing the risk of IPv6 in our networks. Quite often the solution that's given is to basically disable IPv6, right? But should we take that one step further if we're being told to disable technology? Should we go and disable IPv4 as well? Should we go and disconnect ourselves from the whole internet? If we go and disable IPv6, we're actually really dealing with the underlying issues and problems. And Microsoft's got some advice on this as well. And they basically say that IPv6 is a mandatory part of Windows now. So actively discouraging organizations from going and disabling it. And even if you do disable IPv6, say on the network interface card, then those Windows devices will still keep on using it internally, right? And basically, if we go and disable IPv6 now, for whatever reason, inevitably, we're going to have to re-enable it in the future to be able to communicate with those IPv6 only services, say in the US or China, right? Now, it's sort of widely accepted that a way to start to manage IPv6 in your networks and start to understand your risk is to enable filtering on the network edge, right? And by filtering, I mean using allow lists. Because if you were to implement block lists for IPv6, because it's dynamic in nature, it's really easy for attackers to get around those static block lists that you put in place. So chuck some allow lists in there, basically call out exactly the types of use cases you're going to allow in, and also the type of extension headers that you allow as well, right? And you should do this too, even if your internet service provider doesn't support IPv6 yet. Because I know I mentioned some internet service providers before, but there's actually loads that are trialing IPv6 at the moment. And, if they roll that out to all their customers, then at least if you've got some sort of filtering in place already, then you've got a proactive defense, right? So we've spoken quite a lot about what the sort of risks are of IPv6 and sort of the issues. But what about the security benefits, okay? There's absolutely loads. There's far too many to just cover in this little short time frame we've got now. And the ones that I'm mainly going to talk about, because we've not got a massive amount of time, is the security benefits related to the size of the address space. Cool. So you can't just scan IPv6 like you would with IPv4. The address space is that large that it takes so much time to scan it that it makes it impossible. And that kills most of the attacks at the reconnaissance stage and stops them progressing from that reconnaissance stage, right? As organizations as well, because we'd be allocated such a massive space, it means we've got flexibility. It means we can architect some really cool network structures. We can do segmentation. We can do filtering based on hierarchy, all that sort of interesting stuff, right? And now if we take that one step further, if we're an organization we've been allocated this massive IPv6 address space, when we start dividing that down, inevitably we get down to the device level. And if you were to go by the book, each device in your network should be allocated a space that is nearly 5 billion times larger than the entire IPv4 internet. So it's absolutely massive, right? And again, that gives our devices a bit of flexibility to what we can do. So they can use something called stateless address auto-configuration, or SLAC for short. And what they can basically do there is they can go and configure their own IP address from that range. And what they can do is they can rotate that IP address. So from an attacker's point of view, that's a nightmare, because if you're trying to scan a network, work out where these assets are, it's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing, which is really good from a security point of view. We can go further with that as well, and there's something called privacy addresses, where if you've got an IPv6 device, every time it goes and reaches out to an external service, it basically uses an IP address for that session. As soon as that session's done, it throws that IP address away, which is great. It makes them really hard to track. It's really good from a privacy point of view. All right. So there's been a little bit of research as well into if you are attacked over IPv6, it's actually easier to defend from those attacks too. And there's loads of research into this space. So, if you go and have a look into that, it's some really good stuff. Okay. So hopefully we're starting to see that the issues here aren't necessarily in IPv6 itself. It's the fact that we don't have visibility of what our IPv6 exposure is. And that our knowledge of IPv6 isn't at the same level as what we've got with IPv4. So let's go and have a look at the original question then, right? So IPv6, I thought we only used IPv4. Well, to most people, that's true. Because the visibility that you've got of your networks and your infrastructure is only of what's going on in IPv4. But in reality, and what we've seen, is that IPv6 is heavily embedded into our networks. And it's probably something that we should pay more attention to and account for in our security policies and procedures. I mentioned before that it's quite difficult to perform reconnaissance against IPv6, but reconnaissance against IPv6 is actively happening. And what these attackers are actually looking for is sort of low-hanging fruit. They're looking for IPv6 networks where the organization's basically forgotten about it or where it's not been configured correctly, right? So what we can do as sort of security professionals is begin to understand what our IPv6 exposure is, begin to understand what some of those attack vectors are, and in doing so, will put us ahead of the vast majority of other organizations out there and mean we're no longer the lowest hanging fruit, right? So basically, IPv6 is the next generation of the internet, and that's really exciting. It's something that we should all embrace. But what we need to make sure is that it is implemented securely so that it can continue providing, long into the future and for the next generations. So thank you for listening, and I hope you found that interesting and learned a little bit. If you did find it interesting, you want to learn a little bit more, then we have got a LinkedIn page where we do regularly post about IPv6 issues and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I'm conscious it's lunch as well, so if anyone wants to grab me outside, by all means, or...
Yeah, if we can save the questions and you grab him, just come up and have a chat rather than doing the random questions, because there is going to be a queue for sandwiches, because yesterday was quite a long queue.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.